Okay, we're going to continue our study in 2 Samuel, and tonight we're going to be looking at two chapters. They're both kind of short, and they really kind of go together. A little bit of introduction before we get to those two chapters, because as we mentioned before, 2 Samuel is not chronologically told. So we were recently at the end or near the end of David's reign as king. And now in these two chapters, chapters 9 and 10, we're going to jump back towards the beginning of his reign. We do this, we know we can do this because of the textual clues. Because when we're at the end of David's reign, we see that he's subdued all of his enemies, and the nation's pretty much at peace because he's got a dominant military presence there. Now we come to chapters 9 and 10, and there are threats from around, and so this predates that significantly. So that's how we determine when did this come in the timeline. Because this book was written thematically, not chronologically. So that's the first thing that just to note. Second thing, when you get into this, what you think about human dynamics? You know, anytime there's a human interaction, anytime you interact with somebody, communication takes place. There's two parts of that communication, right? Let's say you're the speaker. It's you saying what you really mean and meaning what you really say, right? That's critical. The other part is the person receiving that and interpreting what you said correctly. And that sounds so simple, right? That's called communication. And it seems to happen quite infrequently in these days. You know, you watch television and politics, and you can have people sitting on a couch together having a conversation and just demonizing each other, and neither listening, neither interpreting correctly, and probably neither meaning what they say or saying what they really mean. That's just the nature of where our world is. It's a little communication taking place. We have examples in these two chapters of the importance of communication. In chapter 9, we're going to see that when David made a covenant back in 1 Samuel with Jonathan, in fact, he made 3 covenants with Jonathan, that he meant what he said. And that's going to come to a head in chapter 9. And then when we get to chapter 10, we'll see the damage that can be caused by interpreting poorly, and it can be tragic. And so it's a really cool juxtaposition, again, at the beginning of David's reign as king. Now, these two chapters, 10 more so than 9, are also important because 10 and then skip 11 and go to 12. 10 and 12 are both dealing with war with the Ammonites. And in the middle of that, it's like when we go to the parallel passage over in Chronicles, those two wars, those two skirmishes come together back to back. But here, smack dab in the middle, something we're going to get to next week, is chapter 11, and this is David and Bathsheba. It's a famous story, we all know it. And it happens in the context when David is fighting these battles. And so just keep that in mind as you realize why are these kinds of things that he is doing, that he's involved in, why are they significant? And how would they lead up to such a tragic failure on David's part when you see him keeping covenant with God and honoring God mostly, but little tiny chinks in his armor here and there, and making certain decisions that had set him up for failure. I want you to notice that as we're building up to it. So let's get started in chapter 9, and we're going to call this message for 9 and 10. I'm going to put them together. I'm just calling it housekeeping because David is kind of taking care of some things as he gets going in his kingdom. So in chapter 9, we have the story of Mephibosheth. Beginning in verse 1, David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now, why is David asking that? And he's asking that because he had a covenant relationship with Jonathan. Remember, Jonathan is Saul's son. Saul is trying to kill David, but David's best friend happens to be Saul's son, Jonathan. 3 times we see them affirming a covenantal relationship. Now, what do I mean by that? Both said that they were going to do something, and because of their friendship, because of their love for each other, they committed to do certain things for each other. The first and the third, I'll just tell you when they happened, but we'll look at the second one. The first one happened right after David killed Goliath. Jonathan recognized this guy is important and God has his hands on him. And he says, I'm with you. The third one happens when David is fleeing from Saul in the wilderness, and Jonathan meets with him and covenants to protect him. And a similar covenant is made also, and the one I want to look briefly at, just a portion of it, is when Jonathan made David swear to show his kindness to his descendants. Watch this. Let's jump back to 1 Samuel 20, verses 12 to 15. I'm giving you a couple verses for context. Then Jonathan said to David, I swear by the Lord, the God of Israel, that I will surely sound out my father by this time the day after tomorrow. If he is favorably disposed towards you, will I not send you word and let you know? So remember, Jonathan was trying to convince David, my father has decided he doesn't want to kill you, but let me go check, and I'll let you know. Because Jonathan was really caught in this horrible ground between his father, the king, and David, the rightly anointed, soon-to-be king, and it was a horrible place. So he was trying to be a good son and a good friend at the same time. Verse 13, but if my father intends to harm you, may the Lord deal with Jonathan, be it ever so severely, if I do not let you know and send you away in peace. May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. So in a covenant, both sides have an obligation. Jonathan just said, here's my obligation to you. I'm going to look out for your interests. Okay. Now, what is David's obligation in this covenant? We see it in verses 14 and 15. Jonathan says, but show me unfailing kindness, like the Lord's kindness, as long as I live, so that I may not be killed. Why would he say that? Because by this point in the story, if you remember our study of 1 Samuel, by this point in the story, everybody knew that God had anointed David. Everybody knew Saul was going down and David was rising up. And so Jonathan isn't going to fight against the Lord because Jonathan loved the Lord just like David did. And so he said, I don't want to be killed. And so I'm looking to you, the guy I know is going to be king. I don't want to be killed. And verse 15, he says, and do not ever cut off your kindness from my family, not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of this earth. So did Jonathan fulfill his part of the covenant? He did. Of course, he's tragically killed in battle the same day as his father and dies, and it's a tragedy. But David now, as we saw in verse 1, he said, is there any one of Saul's family to whom I can show kindness? Now, there may be another reason he's saying that, but let's follow the story and see what happens back in 2 Samuel 9, verse 2. Now, there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? At your service, he replied. The king asked, is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? Ziba answered the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet. Where is he? The king asked. Ziba answered, he is at the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in Lodabar. So King David had him brought from Lodabar, from the house of Machir, son of Amiel. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to him to pay him honor. David said, Mephibosheth, at your service, he replied. That was a lovely story. I love the back and forth. It's great. It's great drama because there's actually a lot happening here. It reads very simply, but you got to think about it just a moment. Who is Ziba? Ziba was former servant of Saul. And what does Ziba know? Ziba knows where the last living descendant of Saul is. Now think about it just a moment. Does Ziba know David's motive? He has no clue. David said, is there anybody still alive? Yeah, there's one guy. Where is he? And he tells him. So, did Ziba betray Mephibosheth?
No, because he was asking, David said, is there anyone left I can show kindness to? He didn't say harm. He was talking about kindness.
Yeah, Ziba doesn't know that.
But that's what he said to Ziba.
That's what he said to Ziba. Yeah, Ziba doesn't know the truth of that.
Yeah.
In fact, you never tell somebody when you want to bonk them on the head, hey, where do you live? I want to bonk you on the head. And you say, where do you live? I have something for you. That's what you say. That's not what I say. If I ever say I have something for you, I'm not going to mock you. Right? No, you get the idea, though. So this is a betrayal. So what is Ziba's motivation in this? Some would say, well, maybe he's just trying to ingratiate himself to David. Others would say he took David at his word, because David had a reputation for honesty. But remember, David is also a warrior. We don't know Ziba's motives. We are going to see him in about 5 or 6 chapters. We're going to see him be a bit of an opportunist. But for now, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. We don't know the motive. It is what it is. Now, when we talked about Mephibosheth, we saw him several chapters ago. Let me just remind you. Oh, no, I'm not going to remind you. Let me just read it to you. I didn't put the verse in. I was just going to mention it. 2 Samuel 4:4, Jonathan, son of Saul, who had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. Remember, they had just been killed in battle. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became disabled. His name was Mephibosheth. So he was dropped. You don't drop a baby. He was dropped and obviously just destroyed his legs and never had use of them the rest of his life. He's still son of the king, still the grandson of the king, and so people took care of him. He had resources, so he was provided for, but he was lame. Now let's get the setting real quick, just so you understand, because this is going to matter as we move along. Now, Lodabar, which means no pasture, it's just an interesting name. You're talking 10 miles southeast of Jabesh Gilead, or excuse me, 10 miles northwest of Jabesh Gilead, which is the center of Saul's territory, and about 10 miles due south of the Sea of Galilee. So this is where he's been living. David sends for him, and again, David has now set up his headquarters in Jerusalem because he's trying to bring the tribes together. Angela, he's trying to bring the tribes together. He's trying to unite them together, and moving his kingdom headquarters to Jerusalem puts him smack dab in the middle between the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes. So if Mephibosheth was in hiding and David didn't know where he was, Ziba just gave him up. So I don't want to put a bad motive on him, but it remains to be seen. We don't know for sure. So the timing of this says that we know that Mephibosheth was 5 when Jonathan and Saul died. All right. So that means he was born in 1016 BC. When David captured Jerusalem in 1004 BC, so Mephibosheth would have been 12 when David moved into Jerusalem. And now we're going to see in a few verses here, we're going to see that Mephibosheth has a son. And so that's going to make Mephibosheth at least somewhere in the neighborhood of 20. And I know people are waiting into their 30s now to have kids, but back then, you got married as a teenager and you got busy because life is short. No time to waste. You need kids in order to do the work. So that's why we have kids, to do the work, right? So this will put this somewhere in the neighborhood of 996 BC. Okay. Verse 7. Don't be afraid, David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness. River. Okay, Mephibosheth had just come in, presented himself. He's obviously nervous, so David replies this way. He says, don't be afraid. I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father, Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. This is absolutely beautiful. It's beautiful because David was honoring his covenant with Jonathan. There was no one on the planet that would hold him accountable to that. Nobody else knew. That was a relationship between him and Jonathan. That wasn't widespread. That wasn't known, and he's still honoring that relationship. He says, "You're going to eat at my table." This love is powerful. The idea of eating at the table is in the ancient Near East. It means you're going to provide protection for the person. It's the most intimate place you can pull someone into, and it's kind of ironic. Think about it. The last time we saw somebody being made a table guest was David being invited to sit at Saul's table. Remember, David was made the armor bearer for the king, and he was brought in to sit at the table. And what's remarkable about that? What do we remember about that? We remember Saul throwing things at David, trying to kill him. So whereas Saul was filled with an evil spirit and tried to kill David, David is bringing Mephibosheth in. You're the son of Jonathan, his friend, in order to provide for him, in order to protect him. Verse 8. Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" It's a beautiful picture. Now, some people will notice something remarkable about the parallel here between what David is doing for Mephibosheth and what the Lord does for us. Because we see David and Jesus, there's a lot of parallels that are drawn. Jesus is called the son of David, so there's a lot of parallels drawn between how they operate. Now look at this. Mephibosheth, a dead dog like me, somebody that has nothing to offer, somebody who is incapacitated, somebody whose life is broken, somebody who has no potential, somebody who has no resources that could easily be rejected. Guess what? That's all of us. And David says, "Come and sit at my table." That's what Jesus says. Come in and sit at my table. So he says, "What is your servant? You should notice a dead dog like me." Verse 9. Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops, so that the master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Now it gets a little more complicated, okay? Because yes, at face value, David is honoring the covenant with Jonathan by providing for Jonathan's son. But now we see it's a little more complicated. So by giving the land grant back to Mephibosheth and having Mephibosheth's servant and his family now work that land, where's that food that comes out of that land going to go? It's going to come to David. So David has just financed Mephibosheth's eternal care, or at least as long as he lives, by the land that Saul had owned. So in that sense, it doesn't really cost him anything. He does provide the protection. He does provide a seat of honor, but we see that there's another angle there. So what's the other angle? And this is where I think David is being very, very strategic. And it may explain. Because remember, back in verse 1, he didn't wonder if there was a son of Jonathan. He wondered if there was any sons or relatives of Saul. Why would he be interested in a relative of Saul? Now, the pessimist would say, well, he's worried about somebody fighting him for the crown, for the throne. But I think it's more than that. Remember what David just did. He had just moved from Hebron to Jerusalem. Why did he do that? Because it was central, and he was trying to unite the tribes. So why now find a descendant of Saul? Because Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin. And the Benjamites would be the toughest ones to win over. And so David is now finding a relative of Saul. Oh, good deal. It happens to be a son of Jonathan. Now he can fulfill his vow to Jonathan, his covenant to Jonathan. But at the same time, he can look good to the Benjamites. And he's going to keep doing this and keep doing this and keep doing this. And you know what? It works. Because we go from Saul to David to Solomon, and then the kingdom is divided. 10 tribes go to the north. All right, they form an alliance called Israel. 2 tribes in the south are aligned. Judah, David is of the tribe of Judah. And what's the other tribe? Say Benjamin. Benjamin. Yeah. Wow. So Judah and Benjamin to the south, he unites them. So I think this early work that we're seeing here was actually very strategic and goes a long way to uniting the nation. We don't see that at the surface. Obviously, you have to look at the political dynamics of what's going on. Now, the question is, does that make David duplicitous? Is he just a politician? I don't think so. I think in wisdom, we can often do good things and do clever things at the same time. right? One of my wife, you know what? I shouldn't say this. Okay, I'm gonna say it. Sometimes my wife and I get invited to dinner, right? It happens. We're nice people. But there's always, we're driving to somebody's house. It's like, I wonder if it's going to happen. Because more than one occasion, we've gone to dinner and, you're getting near, it's like the plates are kind of empty and maybe dessert is coming. And then says, so anyway, and that's always the precursor to the reason they asked you to dinner. The reason wasn't just to get to know you and to feed you. They have an ask now. And it happens. And we laugh about it. We don't care. It's like, okay, bring it on. Let's do it. And it happens. And it was so funny because we invited some friends who live in Hako to lunch when we went this past Monday. And we didn't have any agenda. But I was kind of watching them, wondering if they were thinking, oh, when's he going to ask? I was just like, because people do that, right? Is that bad? Is that wrong? No, because you can be nice, you can be good and godly, and you can be clever at the same time. There's an opportunity, and you go and knock. So I think that's some of what's going on with David here. Let's call it wisdom. Let's not say clever. Clever sounds more devious. Let's call it wisdom. And I think David is killing two birds, so to speak, with one stone of taking care of Mephibosheth. Verse 11, then Ziba said to the king, your servant will do whatever the Lord your king commands his servants to do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. He was lame in both feet. And so there's this incredible story, and we see, I think, a lot of things happening there. We do see goodness and grace. We see care and concern. But we also see something I think is more strategic happening, where David is making sure that the Benjamites side with the Judahites when things get bad. And it was an easy thing to do. And I think maybe a good model for us, to be strategic and recognize, not to use people. I don't think he's using him. I mean, he's inviting him to have dinner with him for the rest of his life. That's not a small inconvenience, but it also serves his own purpose. So again, I think he is being wise. All right, that's chapter 9. Very short chapter, but again, the importance of meaning what you say. David fulfilled his covenant to Jonathan, and he did it in a remarkable, grandiose way. It also served his needs. We come to chapter 10. We have the first story of a war with the Ammonites. And the war gets launched, again, by a misunderstanding of what people have said. Again, this is kind of a subsection of that begins to see the decline of David. We're going to see his key sin in the next chapter, in chapter 11. But again, in chapters 10 and chapter 12, we have these descriptions of the battles with the Ammonites. And we had a similar thing happen, if you remember, in 1 Samuel. We had David sparing Saul's life, kind of parallel to him sparing, in a sense, Mephibosheth. And then it was followed by David and Abigail, where he ends up with another man's wife, Abigail. And here in the next chapter, David's going to end up with another man's wife. So the parallelism is probably on purpose. It's just interesting to note. Not really relevant for us as we get into this next chapter. Chapter 10, verse 1. In the course of time, the king of the Ammonites died, and his son Hanun succeeded him as king. David thought, I will show kindness to Hanun, son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me. So David sent a delegation to express his sympathy to Hanun concerning his father. We'll stop there. Now, we don't know what kindness Nahash ever showed to David. It's not in Scripture anywhere that I could find. Obviously, he did something for him. David remembered it, so he wants to show a kindness to his son, and he sends a delegation. This is a fairly normal thing for nation states to do. A leader of a neighboring country dies, you send a group of people with condolences and gifts and sympathy, and they attend the funeral, and they represented one country to another. And I really believe that's all David had in mind. But it's this actual setting that lets us know this happened early in David's reign. By the time we get to the end of David's reign, the Ammonites are not really a problem. They'll pop up from time to time and other things, but David had pretty much cornered them and dealt with them during his kingdom reign. So David sends the envoy to the Ammonites. Now I want to talk for just a minute about the Ammonites. We kind of have to understand some of the dynamic. This will be, if you like history, you're going to love this. If you don't, this is going to be really boring. Okay, so the Ammonites, that's not really good color differentiation there. Is that purple to you down here? This little section, yeah, this little section down here, Rabbah is the capital. This is where the Ammonites are. So you see the Dead Sea down here, and you come up here to the Sea of Galilee. So it's due east of, and this would be Transjordan. So it's on the eastern side of the Holy Land, which today the Holy Land.
It's lavender.
It's lavender, yeah. Well, that's the Ammonites. Who were the Ammonites? They pop up throughout the Old Testament at various times. You remember Lot, right? Lot, Abraham, Lot's in Sodom and Gomorrah, and he gets out of Dodge, and his wife doesn't make it far on the trip before she's got to stop for bizcochos. You ever travel with Costa Ricans? They always want to stop and get some bizcochos. I think of them when I think of Lot's wife because they're dry. They're like a pillar of salt. They're the guys selling, on the toll road. They're out there, they got the mangoes and the cashews and the bizcochos.
That's because you need a cappuccino.
You need a cappuccino. If you don't have something to wash it down, you're going to choke to death. Yeah. In fact, that's probably what happened with Lot's wife. She turned back for some bizcochos and pillar of salt. She's still there to this day. So Lot goes on with his daughters, right? Lot goes on with his daughters. The daughters aren't liking their prospects. This is one of the dark stories of the Bible. And so they both decide that they would get their father drunk and get pregnant by him. Okay, dark story, right? Well, that results in them getting pregnant and having children by their father Lot. And that leads to two cultures, the Moabites and, guess who? The Ammonites. So here, this lavender, that's the Ammonites, and south of that will be where the Moabites settle. Who's the most famous Moabite? Say Ruth. Yeah, we love Ruth. So, definitely there's a lot of intermarriage and intermingling. I mean, these are relations because Lot was was related to Abraham. These are related, but as the tribes get more and more distinct and the stories are disparate, there's conflict. And so going to war with the Ammonites was not an unusual thing. So that's kind of the background of these places. Now, as expected, the Israelites don't always do what they're supposed to do. When we get to the law of Moses, they're coming back up out of Egypt. God gives them the law, gives them lots of instruction. Deuteronomy chapter 2, basically God tells the Israelites, leave the Ammonites alone. And the reason was because of the arrangement between Abraham and Lot. This land belonged to Lot. So these are descendants of Lot, the Ammonites and the Moabites. And that lasts for a while. And then by the time Joshua comes along, so it didn't last that long, I guess, Joshua fights a battle and basically wipes out half of he acquired half of the territory of the Ammonites at that time. So for David, they're, again, just one of the many enemies. Now, David didn't seek war here. In fact, he was sending a delegation. So why is David playing nice with the Ammonites? You could say, well, David's a Bible scholar and he knows that's their land, just leave it alone. Probably not the motivation of it. See, as long as the Ammonites are here and down below here, the Moabites are there, David's got a buffer between anybody that's farther east. Okay? He's got a natural barrier here with the Jordan River, and he's got who's over here, all those Philistines are over there, and he's got to deal with them. But this at least gives him some distant relations, the Ammonites and the Moabites, as a buffer to anybody else. So he's not looking to pick a fight. But the Ammonites don't worship the same God. Let's be clear. It's not just they just have a different culture. It goes beyond that. Solomon, David's son, is going to get ensnared with multiple marriages, and he's going to have Ammonite gods in his pantheon of gods, and that's sin. Good King Josiah, we'll see later, in the era of the kings under the divided kingdom, Josiah, one of his first acts as a child king will be to tear down from the high places the altars that were built by the Ammonites. Jehoshaphat, Uzziah, Jotham, Jehoiakim, all these kings are going to have to fight against the Ammonites because there's conflict there. So, all right, let's get back to the relevant story. Chapter 10, into verse 2, he says, when David's men came to the land of the Ammonites, verse 3, the Ammonite commander said to Hanun, their lord, do you think David is honoring your father by sending envoys to you to express sympathy? Hasn't David sent them to you only to explore the city and spy it out and overthrow it? Oh, advisors are great, aren't they? Man just lost his father, and somebody's trying to stir up crud, right? Verse 4, so Hanun seized David's envoys, shaved off half of each man's beard, cut off their garments at the buttocks, and sent them away. Whew. That'd be bad today. All right, that's a bad move. It was unthinkable. I mean, it was such a disgrace what they did to these men, and it was meant as that. Now, typically in the ancient Near East, it was common in warfare that when you had prisoners of war, that you would demoralize your opponents, your enemies, by humiliating prisoners of war if you didn't kill them. This was an envoy. These were not warriors. These were men that came under the banner of truce, and they did this to them. So the cutting off their garments at the buttocks, this is where the tassels would have been. These were Jewish men, so they had the tassels, which were commanded under the law to remind them of the law of Moses. And so they cut their garments and expose them, humiliate them, and they shave half their beard. Now, I don't think half their beard meant like this way. That's just what we call a trim. Now, I think it would be like this way, like vertical, to make them look silly. And in a culture that men had facial hair and that was a man, and you cut his beard like that to humiliate him, I think that's, you get the idea. So this is throwing down the gauntlet for no reason. Verse 5, when David was told about this, he sent messengers to meet the men. They were greatly humiliated. The king said, stay in Jericho till your beards have grown, and then come back. So he takes the men new clothes, supplies, and gives them permission. You can camp out before you come back. Nobody knows you're here in Jericho. You let your beards grow back. When the Ammonites realized that they had become obnoxious to David, that is one of the top 10 phrases of the Bible. Isn't that great? When they realized they had become obnoxious to David, they hired 20,000 Aramean foot soldiers from Beth Rehob and Zobah, as well as the king of Maacah with 1,000 men, and also 12,000 men from Tob. Okay, so they realized they'd crossed the line, they'd become obnoxious. There was no imminent war, there was no tactical thing, and they know that they've made a mistake. And David is on the ascendancy. He's a notorious warrior. Everybody's heard about him. They know they're in for a world of hurt because of what they've done. So they start hiring mercenaries. All right, so they're going, the Ammonites don't have a big enough army. So they're going out to see if they can get some more soldiers to get ready for battle. We'll look at the battle here in just a moment. Let's press on verse 7. On hearing this, David sent Joab out with the entire army of fighting men. This is kind of an important comment because we're going to see in chapter 11, the tragic verse happens near the beginning, and it says, in the spring of the time when kings go off to war, David stayed home, right? Now, this is kind of a setup, a prelude to that, because David didn't go to fight for his men's honor. He didn't go immediately. He sent Joab, who's the commander of the king's army. Now, like it's mitigated a little bit later, David is going to get into the battle. He's going to show up. But for now, he sends Joab, which is kind of a precursor to the next chapter. We'll see that next week. Now, what's missing here? And this is where you have to always you always have to remember what led up to all this. And it was so many times, and the reason this jumps out at me, so many times when David was getting ready to go to battle, what did he do first? He sought the Lord. He called the priests and said, and sought the Lord. Is it good for us to go? Should we attack today? Should we attack tomorrow? Should we go around? Or should we go straight in? And he'd wait to get an answer from the Lord, and then he would do just that. So now he meets, he hears about his men getting humiliated, and what's his thing? He says, Joab, go. He hasn't sought the Lord. Doesn't mean he's wrong in his action, but you see, that's those little things. Chapter 11, David and Bathsheba does not come in a vacuum. Right? It's the little changes. What's that verse in Solomon? Song of Solomon. Watch the foxes, the little foxes. Beware the little foxes that spoil the vine. You guys get that analogy? It's not the 80-pound gorilla you got to watch out for. It's the little tiny fox. Verse 8, the Ammonites came out and drew up in a battle formation at the entrance of their city gate, while the Arameans of Zobah and Rehob and the men of Tob and Maacah were by themselves in the open country. Joab saw that there were battle lines in front of him and behind him, so he selected some of the best troops in Israel and deployed them against the Arameans. He put the rest of the men under the command of Abishai, his brother, and deployed them against the Ammonites. Joab said, if the Arameans are too strong for me, then you are to come to my rescue. But if the Ammonites are too strong for you, then I will come to your rescue. So you get that. He's divided up his army, and if anybody needs help, then they'll regroup. But for now, they think with half an army, they can defeat the two armies that are coming against them. And now, a little bit of redemption for David not praying is the next verse from Joab. Verse 12, Joab's still talking. Be strong and let us fight bravely for our people in the cities of our God. The Lord will do what is good in his sight. And this is good. This is good. We can trust in the sovereignty of God, but it also means we still have to do our part. We still have to do our work. So he says, fight bravely. Go out there. So this is the first battle that took place. The first battle took place at Medeba and Medeba in Transjordan. You can see it's not really that important, but this is where the miscommunication took place down here. All right, so the envoy went to the capital of the Ammonites, and then they were sent back, and then they're allowed to stay in Jericho. But this is, I want you to see how far they sought mercenaries. Now, we're reading a chapter like that, and you kind of have this idea, it happened in a few weeks. Now, this could be years long. Okay, these battles took place over a long time because they sought mercenaries far up here. This is Damascus, modern day Syria. Okay, so we're going that far north, well away from where David and his people are. We've got mercenaries coming down, meeting up with another group, and they're all going to come down here and then split into two armies, and the battle is going to happen on two fronts. So this is a major endeavor. This is no small thing. Started over what? Over misinterpreting somebody's words. Verse 13, then Joab and the troops with him advanced to fight the Arameans, and they fled. The Arameans fled before him. When the Ammonites realized that the Arameans were fleeing, they fled before Abishai and went inside the city. So Joab returned from fighting the Ammonites and came to Jerusalem. After the Arameans saw that they had been routed by Israel, they regrouped. Hadadezer and the Arameans brought from beyond the Euphrates River. They went to Helam and to Shobach, the commander of Hadadezer's army, leading them. When David was told of this, he gathered all Israel, crossed the Jordan, and went to Helam. The Arameans formed their lines to meet David and fought against them. So this is that last battle happening farther to the north because they've regrouped after having retreated. So now David is there. This is good. David needed to be there. He's the king. He's the commander of the army. Verse 18. But they fled before Israel, and David killed 700 of their charioteers and 40,000 of their foot soldiers. He also struck down Shobach, the commander of their army, and he died there. There's some textual problems with this. When we look at the parallel passage, we have a better idea, but you get the idea. It was a slaughter. It was a rout. And the passage ends in verse 19. When all the kings who were vassals of Hadadezer saw that they had been routed by Israel, they made peace with the Israelites and became subject to them. So the Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites anymore. So again, the Arameans came as mercenaries from the north. The Ammonites were weak in battle, so the Arameans gave up. And now the Ammonites are subject. They have to pay taxes that they before didn't have, or at least more taxes, if David was exacting anything from them before. So through this bad action and really from an advisor who was not thinking and misinterpreted David's motives, it led to a tremendous blow, which is going to only alienate the two groups again. So this is not the last we're going to see of the Ammonites, right? We've got more battles coming in 2 chapters from now. So first Joab led the army, David later went in, but as the battle continues, because the battle is actually still going on in chapter 11. I mentioned chapter 12 because most of the story of chapter 11 is back in Jerusalem between David and Bathsheba. But where is the army? They're still fighting. And how does David kill Uriah in chapter 11? He tells Joab, put him in the hottest part of the battle and then pull your troops back. And so David executed the husband of Bathsheba, his name was Uriah, executed him using the Ammonites for his dirty work. It's tough. But again, I think it's one of those things where words matter. Interpreting those words correctly matter. And remembering where your loyalties lie matters all the more. And so, again, I don't think the problems that we're going to see in David's life happened suddenly or in isolation. It's the little foxes. It's the little chinks in the armor. One of my mentors said many times, and I've said it before, I'm always quoting him. He said, little sins become big sins. Big sins kill you. And that's so true. So this is a tough couple of chapters to recognize. But again, at the same time, we recognize that there is always a war going on. There's always a battle going on. Not a physical war on this planet, though there are those. But a greater war that's going on is a spiritual battle for our souls, for our very lives. And the enemy does not show up with a giant army with impressive weapons. The enemy is subtle. The enemy is slick. The enemy looks like things that you want in your life. And that's how he gets in, from the inside. And so in many ways, David was already losing in these chapters because of little tiny nicks in his armor, so to speak. So we'll see where next week we'll see where that leads. All right? Let us pray. Our Father, I want to thank you so much, Lord, for your love for us. None of us stand in judgment of David or anybody else. Lord, his life is for us an example sometimes of the right thing of being a man or woman after God's own heart. What a testimony that can be said. But that can be on a day-to-day basis, and some days he wasn't. And Lord, when we see that, we're reminded that some days we aren't. And some days we allow the enemy room into our lives to step in and to break down our armor very subtly, very quietly. And so, Lord, we would look to you and ask that you'd strengthen and bless us, that you'd help us to honor you and to love you and to follow you, to beware of the foxes. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.